The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good morning. This is Dan Davidson with the Illinois Soybean Association. We want to, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and the ILSO Advisor, we want to thank you for registering and participating in today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Emerson Nafziger, a professor at the University of Illinois. His presentation today, as is on the screen, the amazing 2017 soybean season, lessons for 2018. This happens to be either the third or the fourth time Dr. Nafziger gave this presentation as he's looked back and recapped the season, how weather and management and things have impacted the production in Illinois. It's always a very insightful presentation. Emerson is well known in Illinois, long-time professor at the University of Illinois, I think about 36 years now, just about, he said, and he's actually sort of officially retiring at the end of this year as a faculty member, but is still around, still going to be doing things, working on corn, soybeans, giving presentations, so he'll still be contributing as we move forward in the future. Just a few logistics. We'll start the webinar and turn it over to Dr. Emerson shortly, and he will go through his presentation, and then when he gets done, we'll do a Q&A. If you are a CCA and you registered and gave your CCA number, we have one CEU in crop management, and your name and CCA number will be turned in to the American Society of Agronomy. So you will get that one credit. And if you're listening to the recording of this webinar, you can still go into their account at the American Society of Agronomy, and you can self-apply for one credit in crop management. So that's still open to you. This webinar is being recorded and is being posted for people to listen later. And during the course of the presentation this morning, just go to the dashboard. If you have any questions, just enter them there, and we'll compile them, and then we'll go through the questions at the end of Emerson's presentation. Again, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and the ILSO Advisor Soybean Management website, I want to thank you very much for participating today, and Emerson, you can take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks to everybody for being on. We have more people on this morning than I remember having on when I've done these before. I was telling Dan it always comes too early and makes me get stuff together that I would probably be putting off, but I guess that's a good thing. And soybeans, as many of you know, is one of my favorite topics. I do spend more time research-wise on corn these days, but soybean has been something for me for well over 40 years, and going back to grad school at the Purdue University. So it's a fascinating crop, a little more difficult to bring along in some ways than corn is, but every season that I've done this, and maybe this is why we started doing this webinar, it comes after kind of an amazing season. And I've sort of posed that question about whether soybeans are now bulletproof, that we can't have low yields even if we try. I think that's a little optimistic, but we'll see the yields here. And certainly we have not been hearing in the last 4 or 5 years, I've not been hearing people say what I was hearing 10 years ago, and that is our soybean yields aren't moving up and what's wrong, and basically what's wrong with soybeans, what's wrong with the breeders that develop them, and what's wrong with you people at the university that you can't make our yields higher. I do give a lot of credit to the genetics and the relentless breeding effort that companies are putting into it. But I've talked to Brian Deers a little bit, and he says, yeah, it's coming at a pretty high cost now. In other words, we're accelerating the pace of breeding, maybe just to keep the progress up. And so I'm not a breeder, and I don't know what that means for the future, but we're certainly optimistic as we sit here today. This is what Acreage is doing. This is kind of an important figure, because if you look over the last 10 years, you know, really back in 05, 06, the Acreage has started apart. Back there in about 2003, 2004. 2003 was a pretty poor soybean yield year for Illinois, and then and acreage might have started out because of that, but that big expansion increase in corn at the expense of soybean was really related to ethanol mandates and the development of corn grain-based ethanol production and utilization of the feedstuff that resulted after that. So it's coming back together now, what people see as a positive sign. They're very different crops in terms of world production and markets. The U.S. does not enjoy the by far best production conditions in the world that we have in corn, well, except maybe for land prices compared to the rest of the world. But in soybeans, we're sort of neck and neck with the big growing areas of South America at this point. And so that what happens in South America, as all of you know, they've had a little bit of problems with getting enough rainfall and getting their crop off to a good start there this year. And so that's one reason the price is doing what it's doing. But world demand is important. The economic conditions are going to be important, trade agreements, all of this sort of thing. But this is one that, as somebody who likes both crops, this is a pretty big swing, as you can see in the last 7 or 8 years. From a gap there back about 2010 or so of we had over 12 million of corn and about 8.5 of soybeans, and today that gap is down to less than half a million acres or so. So that's been a big change, and it has implications for rotations, where we grow soybeans, and so on. And we'll talk a little bit about rotations. We're just going to talk about management aspects today and weather aspects a little bit. This is what the yields of both crops have been doing over the last 28 years, and I just kind of arbitrarily started at 1990. The economists like to go back to 1960, and I guess my view is a little bit shorter than that. I probably avoided some of those disastrous crop years of the late 80s, 88 and 89, both pretty poor. And that might sound like it's cheating, but in actual fact, if you want to make these lines look steep, then put in some early years when yields were low, and they'll get steeper. So I haven't really done it any favors here by doing that. And those lines, we've always noted that the soybean line kind of looks flatter, but that's on a percentage basis, it certainly isn't. And you can see there that first number here says that over that period of time, corn yields, and we've got the projected 2017 yield here. That's the November 1 projection, which is at 198 for corn and 58 for soybeans. You can see corn's been going up at about 2.2 bushels per acre per year, and soybeans at about 0.57. So if you put those on a percentage basis of the crop yield, they're very similar, actually. The other thing we point out is, that soybean yields have been sort of above this trend line for the last 4 years. They've been above the trend line for corn 3 out of the last 4 years. 2015 was the exception, just due to too much water in part of the state that year. But, it's been a 4-year run, and we could probably maybe throw 2013 into there, but certainly since 2014, it's been a 4-year run of really good yields, and we'll we'll take that. So that's one of the things we're talking about today. And I just pulled the soybeans out to make it even look more dramatic. I did this a year ago and showed that, if you choose your years carefully, we're rising about 3 bushels per acre per year if you just count the last 6 years. And that's cheating again by taking this low per yield than normal back in the drought of 2012. Soybeans were hurt much less than corn in that year. So we have added, as I put here from that previous figure and this one, 16 bushels per acre over the trend line yields in Illinois over the last 28 years. That's a pretty good increase. You know, not it's some 40% increase in yield expectation, if we want to think of it that way, just coming in during the farming career of many people that are listening today. I always like to look at this ratio to kind of put the two crops in perspective a little bit. And the high ratio here means that soybeans pretty unfavorable. I just divide the corn year by the soybean yield, corn yield by soybean yield. And we've been running, you know, with these good conditions of the last 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years, we've been running there at somewhere 2 or 3 to 3.5. And what that means is that although soybeans are having a good year, corn's having a good year as well. 2015 was one of those when corn yields were hurt more than soybeans, and back to 2012, you know, that's about the lowest ratio that we have seen for a very long time. Back when soybeans were a new crop in the 30s and 40s, the ratios would have looked, you know, even lower than that because corn yields were so low. But the years that stick out as ones that were really not good for soybeans, 2003 was one of those, and then we had some 7, 8 to 9 were all three really good corn yield years and just mediocre soybean years. So we don't look at a trend line on this really. If you look over this whole period, it's certainly fairly flat. If you look, you know, since with these high ratios and to today, they've come down. And I think we're comfortable with having those in that 3 to 3.5 range, averaging about 3.3 in the better years, and that's a good place to be. For a lot of individual producers, you know, if they have a ratio of 3 with really high yields of both crops, that's kind of a goal that we like to have. You know, if your corn averages 240, hoping the soybeans average 80, and we know in this year that happened in some cases. One farmer west of here said that his farm average of soybeans was 87, and of corn was 260 or so. He thought that the soybeans was more impressive than the corn because he's had 260 corn yields before. But that's the changing mentality and the good news for soybean, that people do have excitement about it. So along with that excitement goes, well, how do we manage it then? And before we get there, let's just look at a few background things from this last year. The USDA in the November crop progress or the crop report, they report pod counts and projected yields. And I put these together last year, and I just added 2017. A little bit unusual, our yields relative to the pod counts, our yields were pretty high this year. And that means that the seed weight, we think, probably was a little bit on the high side. And I graphed it this way to look at that. Here's 2017. So if you have a high yield relative to the pods per square foot, if we're under the assumption that pods have generally about 2.5 beans per pod, which holds up pretty well. Most people don't have, including me, don't have patience to count beans or especially soybean before they're real beans and trying to guess whether they'll turn into real soybean seeds or not. One other way to get this is to look at these, you know, take samples and see how many seeds per pound. Of course, the seed producers are all doing that. But in a general sense down here, I say 2.5 beans per pod and 4.4 bushels per pod equals 1. Don't pay attention to that arithmetic up there. I'm not quite sure what I was meaning. But a bean per square foot out in the field is about a bushel per acre on average. So I put in the 2003 here and 2017, which are kind of the extremes. This one had, in 2003, we had low yields, and pod counts were low, but they were way off the line. In 2017, we're off the line in the other direction. What that means is that we expect that in 2017 seed size was bigger than normal. What that tells us is that these pods were filling at the end of the season and filled a little bit better than what they may normally have done. And so we'll return to that when we talk about weather. We had that warm, dry, sunshiny stretch of weather in the second week of September that I think did our crop probably way more good than we expected. All of us were expecting it to, give up and run out of water a certain hour of a certain afternoon about September the 10th, and it didn't do that. And when it didn't do that, I think we could all take the clue that there was something special going on with this crop that we didn't see coming. Our normal statement is that soybean yields are made in August with rainfall, and corn yields are made in July. This year, we would have to say the cool temperatures of August pushed some of that into September, and we benefited greatly from that. I think if we had had normal temperatures during August, our crop we would not be talking about as high yields as we're talking about. I did some quick arithmetic. This, if you average this based on an assumption of 2.5 beans per pod, in 2003 we'd have had about 4,500 seeds per pound. That's pretty small seed, and we did have small seed. In 2017, this would calculate to about 3,400 seeds per pound. But for those of you who buy seed and buy and so you know kind of how many seeds per pound there are, those sound like small seeds. I don't know if we've done a lot of survey work and seeing how large seeds are, but this is a pretty crude way to measure it on the assumption there's 2.5 beans per pod, but we'll just take it for what it's worth. This is one that you can get off the NASS website, and I encourage people to do that. It's kind of a synopsis of the year and how it went, and I just downloaded this last week. And so you can see they put 5 years of crop ratings up here, and then the one I'm always interested in how planting, emergence, blooming, pod set, coloring means losing color, and then dropping leaves, and then harvest progress. So you get it all sort of summed up there in 2017, then they have 2016, and then they have the average of the last 5 years. So each year you drop a year off and add another one. So these will swing a little bit from year to year. But if you look at, the solid lines are the ones from 2017. And we had the good start, a really good start to planting, and then we stalled out for a couple of weeks during the deluge of late April, early May. And then we started back up, kind of starts and stops. And you can see by the end of planting progress, we were a little bit ahead of what it's been. But it was a pretty uneven, pretty rocky planting season for soybean, and there was certainly some replant that went on here. Crop fields that we saw some just historically low stands in some fields that just got drowned after they were planted, and the temperatures were low, and we killed a lot of soybean seed this last spring, I'm afraid. Emergence progress was good, and then the other ones pretty much follow along. If you look at, we always pay attention to this, how much from setting pods to sort of losing their color, the duration of this is how long the seed's really filling, or at least it's an indirect measure, and it's always good, even though it's kind of subtle here. You can see our pod setting and our flowering and pod setting were a little bit early, and then losing color and dropping leaves was not early, and that's always a good sign that we had a few extra days in there. And I always remind people that we've measured soybean seed filling rates, as high as 4 bushels per acre per day. So we can't just discard that and say, a couple days certainly can't make any difference. It really can. And I think this last year it did. Then our harvest, you all know about harvest progress. It was fast early and slow late, but we got it done. and so we'll take it. It's a little bit interesting, although I never pay a lot of attention to these ratings. I don't really know exactly how they're done, but they have a process. They're subjective to some extent. I think it's asking people based on what the crop looks like today, how do you think its prospects are? And you can see here that in 2017, there were no, the only surprise is that they went down to this extent, and then we got such high yields, because they were never very good, and then they got worse. And these were just expectations, dryness for the most part, but the canopy took on a better look in August for those who were watching it carefully, and even though dryness continued to batter this. You contrast it to a year like 2016 last year, and it went up and it just stayed up all season long. To be only a bushel less in yield, if that holds up for 2017 than we were in 2016, kind of gives you an idea that these ratings they might be accurate, but they can just not be very predictive. And I think that's what we were seeing this year. So here's a new way to graph this. I found this on the Midwest Regional Climate Center, kind of convenient. This is just monthly rainfall for the whole state. And this is dangerous because almost everybody looking at this is going to say, well, it wasn't like that in my place. And that's probably true. So you can see I've got the 30-year average. That's the official average over a 30-year period that ended in 2010. And here's what we had this year then in 2017. So we really got hammered at the end of April. Most of April was pretty good, and we got a really good start to planting on both corn and soybeans. And then the deluge came, and as you saw, we were slow then after that. And you can see here May was a little bit above average. That all came in the first couple weeks of May. By the end of May, it was starting to dry out. June was below average. July, on average, for the state was above the normal. But this was very mixed. And northern Illinois got pounded with way too much rain in places. And here and in parts of, through parts of central and southern Illinois, we got below normal rainfall in July. August was pretty dry for everybody, and September was extremely dry for everybody. There were no real surprise rains, I don't think, in September. There were some surprising and disappointing lack of rains. In the end, this probably didn't hurt us in terms of yield. Let's look at temperatures, and these are just average temperatures, but it's a quick way to look at it. April was above normal. Normally signals a good start. May and June were about normal, but June was above normal for the first 10 days or 2 weeks, and then pretty much normal to below normal after that. Actually, on average, July was a little above normal, which surprised me when I saw it. But we didn't have very many cool periods, and there were some very high temperatures for a few days during the middle of July. And then August was the big one here, 3.1 degrees below normal for a whole month. That's a lot. That's 100 growing degree days, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's enough to delay the development and push the development to September. Then we had September above normal, and as I said, I think that helped us as well. We actually had drought, and I look at the drought monitor occasionally, and over the season, most of March, southwestern Illinois was dry. Mid-June we had it scattered, and then late July we had it. We never had really the darker colors that show serious droughts. There was some of that in Iowa in late August and into September, but you can see here by September 12th, most of the state was that abnormal dry yellow color, and some was the next step, which is sort of the moderate drought. So we were But all in all, it didn't look like a disaster when we look back at the record on this, but there are certainly areas that, weren't as favorable, and some of those were here in east central Illinois. Sunshine was one of the big stories, I think, for 2017, and you can see here the Illinois Climate Network. You can go and they have about 17 sites around Illinois. I take the one out at Bonneville west of Champaign instead of the one here in town. And you can see that pretty much every month, June, July, August, September, our amount of sunshine was above normal. And I think that's one of the big advantages of getting low rainfall, or having it come in passing thunderstorms, is that you get a lot of sunshine. And I think that may have benefited the crop more than we know. And it's always, a question. Some of you go back and look at 2012, we were just sort of average on sunshine amounts, even though it wasn't raining to speak of. So it's an important aspect, and one that we probably think about. And I often have people say, well, we had low sunshine, and you can see here, it's 2014 having low sunshine in August, but we still had extremely good yields. It was another one when we had below normal temperatures in August. And so these are all connected to one another: water temperature and sunshine. And sunshine really gave us a boost here this last year. So this is just saying what I've already said to you, and we'll move on. But I guess just you can look at those start to finish, early start to planting, then we had a delay, then we finished average, and dry, cool August and warm, dry September. We had a pretty long filling period for this crop. Its season was not ended by drought as it sometimes is. And I do think that our crop is more capable today of taking periods of dryness. I think that's true for corn as well. And in both cases, I'd give the credit to just bigger plants that grow faster and put on bigger root systems. Not necessarily deeper, but just root systems that can get into the soil, tap into the water supply that's there. So there was stress in 2017, but its pattern was favorable for crop yield, is the way I sum that up. And just add a point here that we need to continue to look at the crop when we say, well, it's dry. But if you think back now to the 2017 season, did you ever see the soybean crop look like it was under stress? Back in June, probably the answer would be yes. There were some poor stands that had struggled up, replants and so on, dry weather, very warm temperatures. Let's not talk about dicamba too much, but there was certainly some stress there. But once this crop gets its act together and starts to grow in late June and into July, where it's important to watch for stress is probably from the last week of July into the first week of September, normally. And during that period, I continued to just see that crop out there. It took on that dark green across the top that I think is an absolute signal that this crop is going to do well. And when leaves fell off, we saw the pods were there and the yields were there. So we'll leave it at that. Let's talk about rotations a little bit. We've been running this one for about 20 years, 2 sites in Western Illinois. This is what happened in 2017, and this was the soybean phase of this project, of this study. But continuous soybean is one thing we have in there, and I'm really glad we put it in because it's just something that we watch. Very unusual thing that happened this year was that in continuous soybean, no-till yielded significantly more, that's what the star means, than tilled. We haven't seen that very often. And it's not the only time this year that it happened. We don't know exactly why. Some people have, it's usually gone the other way, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. I'll show you the next, which shows you the long-term average on these plots. Also, the other thing to point out here is that the penalty to continuous soybean, and that's based on the average here of the tilled and no-tilled versus corn following soybean, was higher than it's been in most years. These are three crop rotations here: corn, wheat, soy, and wheat, corn, soy. And you can see that they do yield more than corn soybean rotation. Not enough to make that a good viable system if you can't double crop or don't have other reasons to be growing wheat, because wheat doesn't really hold up its end in terms of cash crop income. But and that's true even though wheat was we set a wheat record, yield record this year, and had, you know, excellent quality. But I mentioned when we started, corn and soybean are different in the world with regard to what we do here in the U.S. Corn Belt, and wheat is very different. The U.S. is sort of an average yield country for wheat, but we grow wheat, you know, it's got its comparative advantage in the U.S. where it's too dry to grow other crops in most cases. We can grow an outstanding wheat crop here, but the quality is not always great, as we have seen in some recent years. So we won't say much more about that. This is the soybean yield averaged over those previous years. And I started 2004 because we had some susceptible varieties in early in this study, and I wondered why we did that, but we did. And we learned something from it. It says that cyst nematodes are bad, and if you have high numbers, that's even worse. You can see on average, tilled has out-yielded no-till, and that's been true for each one of the rotations. So we saw something different than that this year. And our yield penalty to continuous soybean has, on average, only been 6 or 7%, less than about half the percentage that we saw this last year. I just threw the corn one in to show you what corn did there. This is kind of a fluke, I think. It looks like we lost a couple plots, and I don't trust this number here. But there wasn't much effect of tillage, and continuous corn did relatively better there than we've normally seen. I showed you this a year ago. We're terminating a study that was in place for about a dozen years at 3 locations. And it's a corn-soybean comparison. So we had each phase of that, and I won't spend a lot of time reconstructing it, but the ones down here that don't have a star by them, they were intact in 2016. So we split the plots basically, and we terminated half of it last year, and this year we terminated the other half. So I'll show you what we found in 2017. What that means is this year we had some soybeans after soybeans after soybeans. We had some that had 2 previous soybean crops. So we're able to look at that question a little bit more. But this is what we found last year, averaged over those 3 years, that having continuous corn as your previous crop, and it had been corn for 13 or 14 years, really boosted yields last year. And this would be, you know, soybeans that replaced corn, and so this is soybean following soybean, and so is this. They weren't a disaster or anything compared to soybean following corn. But that's what we found last year. This is the one at Monmouth this year, and to my surprise, continuous corn wasn't very helpful to the yield. And then even more surprising was that 2 years of corn and 1 year of corn didn't yield any better than 1 year of soybean or 2 years of soybean as the previous crop to soybean. So I'll just leave you to ponder that. We're not going to go into much detail on it. But what I discovered looking at this and was so surprised was that the number of years of corn in the previous 10 years, in other words, we if you want to say it that way, we sort of, maybe we kind of cornify this soil for somehow, and that soybeans can benefit for more than a year from it. So this is the number of corn in the previous 10 years, and of course this one was corn, continuous corn until this year. This one was continuous corn until last year. So it's just something to think about a little bit, and I'll be talking about it more as time goes on. We didn't see this at the Urbana site. We saw the more typical response to continuous corn that we've seen before, just a nice yield boost and more of that stair step down, 2 years of corn, 1 year of corn, 1 year of soy, 2 years of soy, is sort of, increasing amount of decreasing amount of corn, increasing amount of soybean in the recent background. And this is what I expected to see both places and didn't. And so that's just the equivalent figure to that. There still seems to be some relationship between how often a field has been in corn compared to soybean in the previous years. But I'm not thinking that, we should make too much of this after 1 year. But in rotation, then finishing out following continuous corn compared to 1 year of corn added little to soybean yield at Monmouth, about 10% at Urbana and Perry. I didn't show you the data, just analyzed it here in the last day. There's a hint that soybean might benefit from having more corn in prior years, not just last year, but that's just a hint. And in the corn-soybean rotation, no-till soybean yielded less than tilled at Monmouth, and about the same as tilled at Perry. The penalty and then so this is my soybean following soybean, which is a topic we definitely wanted to mention today. And this sums up our data from this last year. The penalty to soybean following soybean compared to soybean following a year of corn was unusual in 2017. That penalty was about 11% at Monmouth and about 14% at Perry in the corn, soy, wheat rotation, and it was negative. In other words, continuous soybean was greater than corn, soybean at Monmouth and at Perry, and positive, which is the direction we expect it to be in. Remember, this is a penalty we're talking about. So when I say it's negative, that means continuous soybean following soybean yielded more than corn, soybean following corn at Monmouth and Perry, and positive at Urbana in the corn, soybean. So these are the two separate studies I've showed you. And in the corn, soybean rotation, no-till soybean yielded less than the tilled at Monmouth and about the same at Perry. And no-till out-yielded tilled when we add continuous soybean. That one's just a sort of an unusual thing that I thought I'd throw in here. I don't think we've ever seen that before, where no-till yields more than tilled in soybean. And I've tried to figure out why that might have been, and I can't come up with any good reasons. We can't think of anything that follows soybean harvest that would be beneficial for the next year's soybean crop, but compared to whether soybeans following corn. So summing up then for 2018, I think we're in soybeans following soybeans. There's absolutely no reason to, lose sleep over this. It's mostly business as usual. In other words, manage as usual. We should expect a 5 to 8% lower yield for soybean following soybean compared to soybean following corn. That's just an expectation. That's over many years of looking at it. In terms of yield, I think tillage is a neutral thing. Nobody that goes and tills soybean stubble that expecting to see a yield boost for the next soybean crop is probably going to see one, and vice versa. Those that don't till soybeans into soybeans that do it no-till are likely to have just as high a yield. So I don't, unless there's some good reason to be tilling, if you're going to go soybeans after soybeans, I think the best policy is very likely to leave that untilled, certainly untilled over the winter. And I see fields that didn't have anhydrous put on them, so I'm expecting that some of those might turn into corn following or soybeans following soybean. And cyst nematode, that's really the one to watch. We don't expect, say, soybean following soybean to have more problems with most of our other diseases and or insects, but cyst nematode is the one that could. And I've mentioned that before. If you have high counts, or if you think you might have high counts, or if you've never taken a count, it might still be a good idea to do that if you're planning to put soybeans back there. We'll talk a little about variety trial results just because they were high, and we always can look at things like this. And this was in the region 1, our northern 3 locations, and later maturing varieties actually yielded less there, which always makes it kind of interesting. I'm not giving you those, but these would correlate well to the maturity ratings that they're given. These are actual maturity dates in that region. This was the opposite. This was in region 4, which is south central Illinois, kind of along I-70. And actually those, that's very unusual to see a response like that. It's about a bushel per acre per day more for every day later in maturity. That's substantial. The problem is that just the region south of that showed the absolute opposite, and it looks a lot like the northern one. So what we're trying to do on this sort of thing, we're trying to outguess what the weather's going to do, and even if we could figure it out, we're not going to predict the weather very well. And I think the message is just choose good varieties, use maturity as a way to, spread harvest maybe a little bit. But look at these, from the earliest to the latest, there's 10 days or 2 weeks in maturity. And so we can harvest soybean fast, and that might be worth doing, but it's always something to keep in mind. We can't do a lot of, yield potential is the main thing. Maturity generally should be and is a secondary consideration. I was able, out of the variety trials, to extract, if you look at them now, this year we put in the trait Roundup Ready 2, Roundup Ready 2 Extend, Liberty Link, and non-GMOs. So they're called conventional. In the report, you can go online to the U of I variety trials and find this easily. And I put these together in a way they're not put together there, because I averaged the Roundup Ready 2 and the Roundup Ready 2 Extend. I showed you some of these data last year, and there were about equal numbers of the two in the trials last year. This year, it's 2/3 to 3/4 Extend to 1/3 to 1/4 of Roundup Ready 2. And you can see in maybe even more than that. So Roundup Ready 2 without the Extend trait is pretty much fading and pretty quickly. Here's the yield difference between the two. And this is, if it's positive, that means the Roundup Ready 2 yielded more on average. And that if it's negative or well, none of them are negative. So 2 of the 3, last year, 1 of the 5 regions, the northern one, did have that difference. And I just heard Sean Connolly this last week at Ames, Iowa, talking about this, and he said in Wisconsin they found this same difference, but they attributed almost all of it to more white mold. Well, I don't know if we had white mold anywhere this year. We just never had really the conditions for it. I won't say we didn't have any. And so I don't know if that was really part of the story or not. But we only found that northern one last year to yield more with the non-Extend traits, just average. So these aren't fair comparisons necessarily. They're whatever companies entered into the trials. And so we also expect those, we expect that these varieties without traits, might decrease even further. And this may be the last year we can have even a meaningful comparison. So we're putting, the Liberty Links are in here, and you can see their numbers are sort of in between those. They've come up as well, and generally they're doing well. I didn't make a comparison between these and the other groups, And then we have the non-GMOs here, certainly in the southern part of the state, you know, these, and well, for most of the state, whatever conventionals are being put in aren't really holding their own very well against the ones with traits. So that's the story on that. Two of these with a star means that I did a paired t-test or just a t-test on those, and it showed that they were significantly different. Where it says NS, that means not. And this one's a question mark because it was significant at, I don't know, the 10 point something percent error level. And that's, you know, that's, some people could let that one drift to significant and some people would say not. So I just left it in between. So lessons on varieties. Yields were high at most of the sites. 2 sites were lost due to water damage, 2 of the 12. 11, dicamba damage at 1 site, and I'm not showing you data on this, but had little effect on the yield of susceptible varieties. This is what I've heard farmers reporting as well, that they had damage and still yielded well. And I think that's partly because of the season we had and that we didn't have conditions that made that damage continue. Leaves could grow back, in other words, in pods and stems. The effect of maturity on yield varied by region. We won't say much more about that. Unlike 2016, we saw little or no lodging. Plant height was not moderate, normal, and just generally, you know, they were solid trials with extraordinarily high yields. Couple of our sites had yields, you know, drifting up into the 90s of some varieties, and we're averaging in the 80s. The extend varieties increased as a percentage of the entered varieties, and as a group had slightly lower yields at 2 or 3 of the 5 regions. Planting date will speed up here a little bit, but the common comment that I heard this year and last year was that early planting meant high yield, later planting not so much. We saw, this is our Monmouth results of planting date this year. We didn't really see that very much this year. I mean, this would be kind of normal, but going through towards past the middle of May, these yield drops are certainly not higher than we would normally see. My guess is that plants and roots needed every growing day they could get in order to make high yields, and that even late planting in many parts in Monmouth conditions were pretty ideal, but in many parts of the state never had those stress conditions. Down at Ore Center, Perry, 100 miles south of Monmouth, these are a little more typical of what we'd say is a pretty severe planting date response. You know, we went from above 70 or about 70 planting in the middle of April to down around 50 planting in the middle of June. That's a pretty big drop. That's our summary over the years of doing these kinds of studies. And it tells us that, you know, yields start to drop slowly as we get into May. But, you know, that's just because the line says that. These really would not be much lower. And this is the first week of May here. And then as we get later on, of course, they really do start to trend down. So yield losses with delayed planting weren't always high in our studies this year. And I think that was true with some farmers. I've heard some comments about that as well. The key was weather conditions during pod set and late seed fill. Late plantings, in some cases, didn't have enough time to fully form their plants and roots before water became limiting. And as conditions allow going forward, then we need to plant, if we can plant in mid-April through early May. One farmer who had high yields told me that he started or finished soybeans before he finished corn. I'm not going to sit here and recommend that, but if you can plant both at the same time, and you know, this year finishing well before the heavy rainfall and cool temperatures we had was, you know, if you finished far enough before and they were coming up, that was good. If you finished right before, it wasn't so good, and probably was true for corn and soybeans both. Seeding rate, and you know, this is something we've been running the last 3 years now. We're up to 20 sites, and we're planting 50, 100, 150, and 200,000. In the last 2 years, we've split them with seed-applied neonicotinoid insecticide. That's with both of them had the full seed treatment package except for the neonic. We put it on separately. and we did stand counts and yields. I showed you this one a year ago, and just, you know, scattered all over the place in terms of where the optimum was and the yield levels. Things were much neater and cleaner in 2017. But also a little bit surprising, you know, we didn't see any of these high yields down at 50,000 plants or highest yields. All of the response curves look very similar. And I put the optimum in on each of these, the yellow triangle, showing where that last seed just paid for itself. And so you can get the idea. And these are actual stand counts. So we planted 200,000 and really pretty consistently got about 160,000 or so plants. There's one location where we didn't quite get there. Where the seed treatment insecticide, there were a couple sites where they did some good. In this one, you can see it improved the stand, but not the yield by very much. In this one, it improved the yields on average, but that's mostly coming from this lowest stand here, but it didn't really improve the stand. So we had both of those things going on, but on average, they really, neonics, both 2016 and 2017 really didn't do anything if you look at them across locations. This does look a lot neater than it did last year, though. These are the 20 trials now over the last 3 years. And you can see I drew a circle around this, and these are clustered really nicely now. And it's basically saying that, if we can get 110 to 120,000 plants out there, that's going to take 140 plus or minus thousand seeds at 80% emergence. We're good to go. We would be putting more seed on out here for these locations than we would need, but you can't predict where those are. And so I think we're on even solider ground now with seeding rate than we were before. And I just said that to you. I don't need to repeat it. This is one that I put in at the last minute. In our rotation study that I showed you, the corn, soybean, continuous soy, and corn, wheat, soy trial at Monmouth this year, they did the great thing of putting the Elevo on half of each soybean plot. So we've got this rotation and tilled and no tilled, and then with and without neonicotinoid. Basically, the disease that I'm talking about Elevo, not insecticide. The disease that Elevo is out there to try to eliminate or prevent or reduce the damage, it just never showed up. So we're good to go, and it just shows you the nature of this. And even though the pathologists say don't expect rotation, to have much effect, you can see here, tilled and no tilled didn't have much effect either. Some years, I'm pretty sure, because soil conditions are going to be different, tillage and rotation might have an effect just by their effect on soil temperatures and so on. This year, we certainly did not see anything like that. And let's finish up with some nitrogen. I showed you these last year. We got at Chillicothe in a loam soil with irrigation. We got some big yield boosts with planting time in 2015, application of nitrogen. Same thing in 2016, not in 2017. So back in the same location, same soils, we just didn't see any effect. We could still bump yields by throwing nitrogen on 4 times, but economically, of course, not really. And that was a rate study that Josh Vonk put in. This is close to where he's from, and you can see that it doesn't blow you away too much with the advantage of putting on nitrogen. And this is what we saw in Urbana this last year. So nitrogen on soybean, we aren't really changing our tune from this year. We did see a few positive responses, but not like we've seen in 2015 and 2016. And there's still no consistent finding that high yield soybeans benefit more from N application than lower yielding ones. And most high yielding fields in 2017 did not receive fertilizer nitrogen. And from our results, we suspect would not have benefited if it had been used. So we can't justify N fertilizer as a routine practice, but we have seen a few responses in lower organic matter soil, and that's encouraging us to at least continue to think about it. And I'd encourage anybody to do strips and see whether it might actually be providing a yield advantage. We've just seen enough to intrigue us that it's something that we can't dismiss. But I think knowing what we know now, just going out there and taking airplanes and flying on nitrogen on soybeans is something that's really not going to pay its way until we know more than we know now. So this is just a recap of lessons. You know, I said soybeans are resilient, stressed from dry soils, but lower temperatures and lots of sunshine. Canopy and plant size were more typical, and I think that was allowed for more efficient movement of sugars to pods. The canopy maintenance doesn't take a lot. We didn't have diseases, and so on. So this is all a recap of what I've talked about. I did throw in here, there's very little disease or insect pressure in 2017. With the exception of Japanese beetles, and then some, I heard that some fields got sprayed 3 times in western Illinois. Over at our ore center in Pike County, we sprayed soybeans and corn both for Japanese beetles, and I think it's the first time we've ever done it. One more that I just analyzed and put in this morning. Jason Niekamp down at works for me here and has been very interested in that, and he put out a sort of factorial experiment this last year. There's 4 factors, each with and without, and I've got them lined up that way, so it's a lot to look at. And but the bottom line, these, you know, don't pay too much attention to these statistics here, but the highest yield we got had micronutrients, nitrogen, and fungicide on, but it was 78.5. It was about 4 bushel more than where we didn't use any of them. And that, even that, you know, statistically, it's not really very different. So you can look through those. Insecticide tended to have very little effect. Fungicide tended to have some effect, and that's how this thing came out. So we'll be looking at this some more. I see there might have been a little error in there, but it's maybe not a complete factorial. But in any case, it's something interesting that we're looking at. And these are, you know, we chose one of our best places, and they're in 15-inch rows. We did everything. These are on the good side of yields that were here at South Farm this last year. And, you know, I think this is the kind of thing that has us saying, well, are you sure that these inputs are going to pay? And the micronutrient was a mixture here. Nitrogen was put on at 2 times. And so we were trying to leave nothing to chance here. And these are just good information added to what we've had before. You can see here that some of our lower yields were actually where we didn't use fungicide. And fungicide, I think, would sort out as the key one here to making yields higher. Well, that's the end. Thanks for all of your attention. I've run up to my hour as I usually do, and apologize for that, but thanks for listening. Do we have any questions that...
Okay. Emerson.
Yeah.
This is Dan.
Yes.
Couple things. We can take a few minutes. There's nothing automatic about the hour, but a couple questions here. Actually, some of the questions you've answered during your presentation. What about all these new plant biostimulants? Can we count on them to edge up yield?
We have not looked at very many of those, and certainly haven't spent a lot of time. you know, I suspect that they're not going to ever give us a very visible effect, and it may depend a lot on what soil you're in. If you're on a low organic matter, lighter textured soil, you know, some of these might get roots to growing better and do some of the things that many of them claim to do. I think if we're getting 60, 70, 80 bushel yield levels on soils given in any given year, I think it's going to be very hard to improve upon that by what we can do with adding some microbes and so on.
Okay. Okay, thank you. What is the next big thing that will contribute to higher soybean yields when we're looking at the overall system?
I don't expect to see a big jump. I think we're right now we've seen this, I think, in both corn and soybeans, that the genetics have been, that it's kind of the result of this continual and dedicated, you know, just making crosses and doing selection, that both crops are more tolerant of weather conditions now than they've ever been and can produce really high yields. And I think that we're just going to continue to see steady progress in yield potential. I don't see something happening that just breaks these loose and suddenly we're going to make a 5 to 10 bushel jump in soybeans and never look back. We always are a little bit, we can get carried away when we see 3 or 4 good years in a row with yields going up a little bit. History would tell us that that never continues forever and ever. And stretch runs of 5 and 6 years of yields getting better each year out in a whole state like Illinois are about the limit of what we normally see before things come down.
Okay, okay. There were a couple of questions on seed treatments here, on the role of newer seed treatments, and how important are they for high yield soybeans. And right in with that is, should growers be applying seed treatment inoculants, you know, rhizobia inoculants, today on a regular basis?
There's certainly been a lot of marketing on those, and rhizobial inoculants, I think, would fall under the category of what I mentioned earlier about biostimulants or microbes of various species of microbes now being added and available to put on seed. I think you know, we have not looked specifically at the rhizobial inoculants. I just make the observation that in Illinois, I think it's going to be really tough to see those do very much. Most of our crop looks very well supplied with nitrogen, and our measurements tell us that it is, whether you inoculate it or not. So it's all a mix of things. I know there's been a lot of activity on that, and new microbes have been brought out, and now you can, I think people that are getting seed treated at the dealers have more choices than they've ever had. I just don't have enough information to really speak about those, but what I've seen says that, you know, even a small increase in yield that it takes to pay for these may not be very visible in the field. So they tend to be low cost, and that's an important part of it, that people not put a lot of cost into that. I'd really like to encourage people to do, you know, put one in one side of the planter and one on the other side and see if how they compare. But I know that it takes a lot of work, and not everybody's interested in doing that.
Okay, okay. Okay, all right. Well, we're at just about 11:05, so we're going to bring this to a close. Again, Dan Davidson, and on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association, No-Soy Advisor, Soybean Management website. First, thank you, Emerson, for doing a great overview, a recap of the season, and pulling a lot of the pieces of the puzzle together that kind of explains where soybeans were at in 2017 and how some of these practices are working. Thank you. Again, if you registered for this webinar on the CCA, you submitted your CCA number, you will get a single credit in crop management. And if you're listening to the recording of this event, and you can go on to the CCA website, log in your account, and self-apply for 1 CEU. Again, thank you, Emerson, for a great webinar. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. And this webinar is now ended.